thanks very much for coming. I'm sorry we had a technology glitch. Hansard, you can't do anything in this place unless Hansard is following what's going on. The computer went down. Now we're told it's operating again.
No, indeed.
Huh?
Computer said no.
Computer said no, yes. Minister said no. Okay, thanks very much for coming, Mr. Benedet and Ms. White. I think we've also got Ms. Sommers on online by video link with technology that is working, so that's good to see. We are going to give you enough time because, excuse me, we've moved one of the later sessions to a later date, so we've got plenty of time for plenty of questions and lots and lots of detailed answers. So thank you very much. I welcome you all. Could each witness, maybe starting with you, Mr. Benedet, please state your name and position, title, and swear either an oath or an affirmation.
Renzo Benedet, I'm President and Secretary of the Lithgow Small Arms Factory Museum. Affirmation, I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Ms. White?
Donna White, Custodian of the Lithgow Small Arms Factory Museum. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And Ms. Sommers?
Thank you, Debbie Sommers, volunteer curator, Port Macquarie Museum. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr. Benedet, would you like to start by making a short opening statement?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon all. Thanks for the opportunity to submit our views in writing and also here in person. We are a community-based regional museum run by volunteers. We're unique in the sense that we have the memory and the history of the industrial heritage of the Lithgow Small Arms Factory. We started a museum in 1996. We're renowned nationally and internationally for our collection and also our knowledge. We're also recognised by UNESCO for our archives collection, and we're a leading tourism venue for the city of Lithgow. Just want to make a few points. Government, and this is addressing in the context of community-based volunteer-run museums. The government needs to be very clear and very proactive in the way it supports those museums. Those museums hold intrinsic significance. In our case, that significance is either not understood or ignored by government, and in fact it's probably being destroyed by government policy as we speak. Regional museums per se, as I said, are major drivers for tourism. They do bring dollars to regional towns, and in our case we bring about 9,000 visitors a year. Obviously that generates a fair bit of income for the city of Lithgow. We've not seen or not heard about or not been involved in any state strategy or action plan that is to deal with museums. We get the view, I suppose, given that there's an absence there, that the level of knowledge within government about museums per se is probably less than what it should be. And I've been with the museum now for 3 years, and I've never seen anyone from government come and talk to us about the intrinsic significance that we hold and have. The unannounced changes to the 2017 firearms legislation pertaining to museums was like a sledgehammer with no current or future benefit. It should never have happened. We stand opposed to what took place. And in our view, our museum and possibly others should be excluded from the provisions of the Firearms Act. Regional funding for museums per se is probably underdone. Yes, we do have grants. Grants are probably hit and miss exercises, but there's no dedicated funding for organisations like ours and others which have a national or international standing or show promise to achieve such. And lastly, volunteers, which we have a few of, do a great job. They're the backbone of our organisation plus many others. They need the support that we can give them, the vision, the skills training and the professional support that is required to make them long-standing in terms of the way they work with us and also with other museums. So thank you.
Thank you. Ms Sommers?
Thank you for the opportunity to give evidence today and to do that video link. I appreciate that. I'm here today not only as a representative of the Port Macquarie Museum, but also as a representative of the many community-operated independent museums, you've referred to them earlier today as volunteer-run, across our state. Many of us hold and are responsible, as Renzo has just indicated, about collections of great significance to the people of New South Wales, many of which are also national treasures. This continues to be either ignored or overlooked in state government policy and funding in relation to museums and collections. For example, 3 of the 10 items added to the UNESCO Australian Memory of the World Register last year are in the custody of community collecting organisations based in regional New South Wales. We note many submissions to this committee have continued to espouse the value of touring exhibitions, and these are certainly of importance, value and interest, but not at the expense of exhibitions that tell local stories. Residents of and visitors to regional New South Wales want to discover and understand regional history and identity and where we fit in the bigger picture. There are so many unique and important objects and their stories in community museums waiting to be discovered and shared. For many years now, we've heard plans of great things for the sector, hubs, spokes, nodes and networks that will create or offer a vibrant and exciting sector. The rhetoric has not been supported or made possible by the continuing ad hoc and piecemeal grant and support programs offered to community museums and indeed inadequate funding to the sector as a whole. The term digitisation has been used widely and liberally across the sector of late. One of my colleagues, an archivist, often says, arrange, describe, then digitise. This also applies to our collections. Assess, document, digitise. The real value of digitisation is in sharing the story and not just the photograph or image. We have been sharing our collection digitally for the past 10 years. People contact us from all over the world because of our digitisation work, which I might add is a work in progress. But they are not finding us because we posted a photograph on the internet. They're finding us because we are taking the time to properly research, document and share our collection stories, connections and context together with that digital image. The value of digitising collections is clear. The real cost of digitising collections needs to be fully understood and properly funded. Outcomes of the previous inquiry into museums and galleries in New South Wales were underwhelming for us. Our vision for the future does include a statewide museum strategy with dedicated funding and regionally based paid staff to support and implement that strategy. We remain ambitious about our future. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Question?
Yes, Mr. Benedet. You mentioned conflict with the state government involving the Firearms Act. So what happened involving the Small Arms Museum?
So when the changes were made in late 2017,
Yep.
We didn't get to know those changes until a year later. So we were never consulted in any of the discussions that occurred leading up to the new regulations. Never contacted afterwards, and we only found out by accident that through the Gunnedah Museum that certain changes had been made. And once we heard that the fact that we had to go from a temporary deactivation to a permanent deactivation of firearms, that meant that affected 70% of our collection.
When you say deactivation, you mean wreck them?
Destroy.
Well, destroy the value of what we have in the museum. So we have about 2,600, 2,700 firearms, and 70% of those would have been destroyed under the legislation. Now, this legislation currently talks about permanent deactivation. It's still that is in place.
So, had your organisation had a problem with people breaking in, stealing, or people misusing the firearms in your facility?
There's been not one incident.
So what, governments don't operate in a vacuum. Why would they do something like this? Why would they enact legislation like this?
They did operate in a vacuum on this occasion.
Okay?
No museum was
sorry.
consulted.
Oh, but they don't just have thought bubbles, or was this a thought bubble?
It was someone's thought bubble.
This was exactly a thought bubble.
It was someone's thought bubble.
It was promulgated in secret. and-
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'd like to hear it from the witnesses.
I have a lot to do with this, and I'll let the witness
Mr.
speak.
Chair, I would like to hear
I will,
from the
I
expert
will let the
wit-
witness speak, but I would like to echo what he says.
Okay, Mr. Chair.
It was someone's thought bubble. I don't know who thought bubble it was. It's obviously a thought bubble that's gone wrong.
So-
and completely wrong.
So you're telling me since 1996, you've never had someone break in and steal or fire a gun illegally on your premises?
Not at all. And the reason is because we carry the highest level of security and safety in the museum, and that is prescribed under the Act.
But there's one of the key problems you have is there's no category that's applicable to you as a museum and recognises the nature of a museum as opposed to a private collector or a firearms dealer. Have you spoken with the government about getting a separate category for museum?
Clause 59 says museums under the Act, right? That is in law right now. Now, we've spoken to government many times about the fact that museums should be exempt. They were exempt pre-2017. That is publicly owned museums, but privately ones, they weren't.
May I, Ms. Sommers, why were you nodding in agreement? Is there something you'd like to add? Is there something you're aware of?
No, I'm just agreeing. No one was consulted.
Okay, no. It's important. Or doesn't see nodding, and I saw you nodding, and I thought, okay, maybe. So you're in agreement, okay.
So
Mr. Benedet, would you explain how you found out what happened and what did happen to Gunnedah?
So the Gunnedah situation, the new provisions came in November 2017. In December of 2018, the Gunnedah Museum contacted us for advice as to what they should do because they just had the police on their doorstep saying that they were in breach of certain regulations, of which they weren't aware of.
yeah.
And so it was from December 18 into the early part of 19 that we then got to know what was happening. And then we met with a previous police minister and echoed our sort of concerns and frustration. Then there was a change. Then there was a new government, and we sat down with the current police minister, Minister Elliott, and explained the whole thing to him in total. Put forward provisions around museums, the definition of museums and how they should be classified, and obviously the fact that it got to a situation where we were asked to whether an exemption would be suitable to be exempted from the provision of permanent deactivation. Now, that's where we are right now. That's a halfway house for us because it doesn't suit, and it shouldn't suit, museums. Museums are categorised in the same form as being a collector, a firearms dealer, even though we're not, and we're a different species. But that different species does not reflect and is not reflected at all in the consideration under law, nor is it reflected in the thinking of politicians and advisors around firearms and museums. And the case we've made in this submission and verbally today is that museums are a breed of institution that live for the community, educationally, historically, culturally. And the fact that I can't see that being for a firearms dealer or a collector or a farmer. And trying to get that message across, and that hence why the need for us to say here that museums, and I'm not saying all museums, there are 63 classified museums with permits in New South Wales. Not all of those 63 are apples with apples. And so we've put forward to the Minister and his advisors and also to Registry what we believe the definition of a museum should be under the law.
And so just at the moment, you've got an exemption, a discretionary exemption granted by the minister.
We have.
But there's no, if you like, bespoke arrangement in place dealing with museums as distinct entities from collectors, and that's where you'd like it to go.
That's right. And also the fact that under the law, the police commissioner's got the right to cancel that exemption at his or her will without any reasoning.
And that kind of arbitrary threat hanging over your collections
We're
obviously is something you'd like to see resolved.
We are in no man's land currently in
So to
terms of the
speak.
way the law is, because we're not treated as a museum per se, even though we're under clause 59. But in terms of the fact that the Commissioner's got the right to cancel that exemption. In fact, we have the police coming in next Monday to view and audit our collection. Hopefully we'll then get to the next level of a permit exemption for the next few years with annual audits. But nonetheless, the situation we have right now is that we're in no man's land as a museum, and we're not. And I think the other thing is, more important thing is, there's no distinction between us as a museum or the Gunnedah Museum or any other museum compared to, let's say, a firearms dealer who probably has less requirements on him or her to operate. And they operate in a live situation. We don't.
You would be fine with police oversight and some kind of police auditing, but as against principles and structures put in place for a museum as opposed to a firearms dealer, and recognising the public nature of your institution. Is that where I
Yep.
understand you're at, Mr.
Yep.
Bennett?
We mandate that the government, well, the government mandates security, the security standards
Yeah.
that museums must meet. And none of the, like very few of these 63 museums that now have permits meet those standards.
But you have no problem with those standards being set, but
No,
provided...
no problem whatsoever.
Provided, yeah.
No problem
And
with
then meeting
them
standards which are
checking
designed
up.
for museums.
Yeah.
That's right.
Can I ask a question about the 63 museums? So are they small arms museums, or are they museums that have firearms in them?
Each of those museums have a firearm or firearms in them.
Right.
Okay. Some, I would say, would be backyard operators, if that's the word, to an organisation like ours, which is sort of internationally renowned.
Some of those
but-
museums have a permit, but they don't have, like the permit owner has the firearms on his permit, not on the museum's permit.
So how many, are there other comparable museums in New South Wales or in Australia that are small firearms museums similar to you? Are you unique?
We are by far the largest in New South Wales, by far the largest. Sort of Gunnedah, Uralla, there'd be a few of those organisations that would have probably 30, 40. I mean, we have, let's say, 2,600 firearms. The other museums we're talking about might have a total number of 50 or 60 or 30 or
okay.
25, right?
Okay.
That's the sort of difference. However, where the difference is and lies is that, for example, when we had the senior management of the registry visit our museum, they're overwhelmed by what we have. I mean, Miss White and Kerry Guerin behind me, they're two experts in this field in terms of firearms, technical information, those sorts of things. They, as I said, the officers of registry were actually taken back by what they saw. The firearms collection, the sort of diversity of what we have, the archives that relate to the small arms factory itself that go back to 1910, all those sorts of things are all intertwined. And that's what we're trying to work out and say to the government, we are a museum for the community. We're not here for personal gain like others are.
Now, Ms. Sommers, as a volunteer curator, I just want to make sure that, so the word volunteer is the adjective describing a curator. So you're a voluntary curator. Is that correct?
I'm unpaid.
Yes. I just want to make sure that the adjective was in the right place.
Don't curate the volunteers.
Yeah, that's what I was at.
Everything I do is professional, but I am unpaid.
No, I understand that. I'm very well. So
That sounds like the industry.
does what is the success rate of your organization securing government grants? Like, I know that you've received a grant under the Regional Cultural Fund for a master plan, but what is your track record on securing government grants?
Have quite a good track record of acquiring grants. Let's be frank though, most of them are quite small. They're all project based. But we do have a very high, a good track record in securing grants, but that takes an enormous amount of time. It's taken many years to get that skill up to being successful. And And for example, during COVID, I spent most of my time securing grants for ourselves and a couple of other organisations.
Okay, so if we were to make a recommendation for the government to change practices, what practices should be in place to help museums like yourself secure grants or get assistance? Is there something that we could recommend to the government that they do?
I guess one of the current problems is that we're quite good at getting small grants, but what we really need now are the bigger grants. We've sort of down a pathway where we've outgrown many of the small grant programs that are offered to community museums. And there really isn't a pathway or even a program that will enable us, give us a bit of a step up, a hand up, to participating at a greater level. So the real issue is not necessarily about, people can learn how to do grants. Quite simply, it's answer all the questions. That's always a good start. But there aren't really any programs, and at the moment for us, we're now competing with the Create New South Wales grants, for example. We're creating with the galleries, with individual artists, with screen organisations, and the expectations of those, and also the actual bucket of money, let's be frank, is very small. The expectations are enormously high, and the bucket of money is very small. So it's highly unlikely for us to be able to secure funding of that nature. In regards to infrastructure grants, and the Regional Cultural Fund was a fantastic initiative. The problem is now, though, that, where to next? There isn't another bucket of money. There's nothing to follow through on, for example, our master plan project. So, obviously it was a good idea for us to do the master plan and schematic design to envisage and transform our museum for the next century, but where are we going to get the next lot of funding? So obviously we'll be looking at philanthropy and other things, but we will need some government support.
Sommers, so just to put this in context, I'm from Tamworth, so we're sort of close, but over the hill. It seems to me that, and this applies with the Lithgow Museum as well, seems to me that what's being identified is there needs to be a grants program that deals with regionally significant museums, so that, in a sense, picking winners of the more significant museums that are scattered about the state. Is that what you're identifying?
Sure, absolutely. Look, we really are a regional museum. We happen to be totally owned and run by volunteers. We own our land, our buildings, our collection. So in other places, the council would probably chip in and help support that entity. Our museum's been going really before councils really started getting involved. So our museum's been going since 1957. So, that's been a bit of a problem for those really well-established museums. We provide regional services. We seek grants, we get grants, we run professional development opportunities for volunteers and paid staff, I might add, from other neighbouring towns. So we're already providing that service, and we have the collection to substantiate our status. But what we don't have is any council support or funds that would help us, and that's another issue with Create New South Wales grants. If the state government's going to put money into grant programs or projects through Create, there really is an expectation from them that the local council is providing a cash contribution to that project. That's very difficult for us at the moment.
Just, could I just ask?
Could I just add? Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Lithgow Small Arms Museum sit in that context. I seem to remember back in 2016 or something, when we visited you, that there was some talk that Tales was going to perhaps remove you from the building you were in. Does that make
So the situation
that was coming to an end?
No, so we're still there. And so the situation between us and Talis Australia is that they own the site. We obviously use the museum and adjoining buildings, and we're in discussions with them to acquire both the museum and 2 adjoining buildings off them. It's been an ongoing discussion for 2 years now. Hopefully Tellus can get their act together quickly and sort that out, but that's where we are. So there's no issue about us being kicked off the site, if that's what you're asking.
Well, can I just
add to that
Yes,
question,
yes,
that issue? It's 2 things for me. One is there are, each museum has its own quality, whether they're large, small, or what have you. I suppose from where we're coming from is that I'm not too sure if anyone's done a review of museums in New South Wales, in the context of regional museums, in looking at the significance of what they have and hold, and the international, I suppose, ability to grow that museum to something that is going to be a really world-class effort. And I think, just going back to what Debbie was saying, and something which we also mentioned in our submission, that if you're going to be providing funding, currently the fundings are grants, and they're chopped up into bits and pieces. That can still suffice, but if you had a regional fund that actually purposely drove the growth of those museums that have been earmarked for world-class action, that's what I think would be a great thing to have. Okay,
Mr. Benedet, that actually was where I was going, and what I was going to invite you to both comment on, because look, I go to various towns, quite frankly, here and overseas, and I've got to say, in some small museums, they're great. Others, it might be an hour lost of your life, quite frankly. So,
could I also add there that when you look at the funding regime, you've got the Department of Environment, you've got Create New South Wales, you've got Gambling New South Wales and some other outfit, and plus you've got the federal government. And you think, well, if I took New South Wales, if New South Wales was really genuinely behind museum growth, then wouldn't you sort of, from a funding viewpoint, channel the resources so you have one organisation that coordinates the whole lot? As it is now, probably, obviously our respective organisations here, track certain things, but wouldn't it be good to have one agency that actually is out there supporting museums and then be able to work as a unit across government to make that happen? Currently it's dispersed, and I think there's even conflicts. So I take the regulatory framework conflict that we have with firearms, and I've got on the other hand a government agency who puts out money. Yeah. But it doesn't come together.
All right, well, I accept that, but perhaps part of that's the nature of government. And but can I ask this? And I'm attracted by this concept of, in a sense, a regional museums fund separate from the others, how would you pick, and I'm asking all the witnesses, how would you pick or how would you identify the qualifying factors for who could apply or who would be successful, I suppose, in accessing that style of fund?
The museums that have got the national, international reputation would have had a significance assessment done on them in terms of their collection and archives. And that would be number one. And that would then demonstrate clearly the potential of that museum to grow. And I think that would be a starting point. Right. And then obviously then the resources that are in that museum in terms of their ability to grow and volunteers. So I think, to me, if you had the nub of this exercise is about the significance of the value of what the collection holds, both educationally, culturally, be able to sort of educate and train people, the history of it. So I could easily say the Lithgow Small Arms Factory is a great example of history of Australia in New South Wales and Lithgow, and the museums carries on that tradition in time. And with what we've got now, both firearms and machinery, which we didn't have back in 2016, when we put those together, that would make it probably the most fundamental museum of its type anywhere in the world.
Ms. Sommers?
I certainly agree. There are certain criteria that you would use, and I think you would base it largely around collections. I guess I see regional museums, if you like, dare I say, a bit of a spoke. But I do see I do see regional museums being a spoke of a more, of a state museum. For example, our collections are very compatible and complementary to the Powerhouse Museum collection, and I personally do view it as our state museum. Why don't we change its name? But also our museum has, unique objects relating to Port Macquarie's and early settlement, and indeed the early settlement of the colony of New South Wales and therefore Australia. There's definitely criteria that could be used. What worries me is that you're talking about a regional museum strategy without talking about an overall strategy. And I come back to the fact that I really think we need to have the bigger picture sorted before we start talking about what flows under that, or what's really holding it all up. That's what's concerning me at the moment.
I suppose in my own defence, apart from that we both come from reasonably sized regional centres, my questioning arose out of your identification of essentially competing with such a plethora of different sized and differently focused organisations. That seems to be, in a sense, in my defence, one of the reasons that I am attracted to, in a sense, identifying a funding path that's separate for organisations of the size and capacity of your two organisations. So I won't say anything more at this stage.
I don't. Go on.
Sorry.
No, you go.
The model this morning did talk about the state library model, and it's certainly a model that could apply to museums.
Mr. Bensley?
I suppose just to comment, I hope we don't come across as saying that we're competing against one another as museums. We all have our own bits and pieces, our own sort of history, our own sort of individualness about, about ourselves. I think what we're just saying is that every museum, as long as, it's got that history, deserves a go. But if you're going to go down the track of a regional fund that tries to promote and grow museums to an international world-class standard, I would support that entirely.
I mean, effectively, the museum at Lithgow Small Arms is a technology museum, in essence, isn't it?
It is.
Also a social history museum.
Yeah,
Very much so.
And you'd be aware that there is new law that's currently going through the upper house, or attempting to go through, that will deal with your precursor.
It's not moving real fast at the moment.
No, it's not going very fast at the moment.
That is another inquiry.
That is another inquiry, but it's significant to understand that not only this museum has firearms, it also has all the so-called precursor, and that's a terrible word, all the precursor technology also on display, and also subject to restoration on a long-term project. And in that sense, I'm talking about technology being similar to the MAS. It's, if you like, I don't know, just part of the same manufacturing history of New South Wales, if not Australia.
So we've made a submission to that inquiry. We don't understand it, quite frankly. Don't understand the reasoning. I mean, one of the questions here today, the first question was, whose thought bubble was that? I don't know, again, on this particular issue, wouldn't know whose thought bubble that was.
You don't know what its precursor was?
No, that's right.
Okay. But I just mentioned it. I think in the end of the day, you're on the same page as Ms Sommers, probably in relation to the long-term ongoing funding of museums according to their requirement using a libraries type model.
Sorry, what is a library type bond? Sorry, I don't know what that is.
Recurrent per capita funding.
Recurrent funding.
Yeah, yeah.
Rather than project by project.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I just?
I think.
Can I just ask? I mean, you talked
I think
about.
Mr. Benedet was about to give a more detail.
No, that's fine. No, I'll stay there.
I just want to ask, has the Small Arms Factory Museum received grants in the past?
We have. So the last, say, 3 years, we've been successful with 7, and of the 7, 5 were government and 2 were private. And also we missed out on 4.
And from
All
Create
government.
New South Wales, how many?
We've submitted one, lost one. Sorry, submitted one for zero return
So you've had nothing
from Create New South Wales, no.
from Create New South Wales, okay.
Ms Sommers, I might ask you, and Mr Benedet, I'll ask you, because this library funding model has been raised, and I suppose I'm asking you to comment. The library funding model involves a per capita, as I understand, a per capita funding of local government for the provision of libraries. That's just my understanding, is it? Whereas your organisation and Mr Benedet's organisation is not local council, is it? So if what you've got in a particular area, and I think in, say, Port Macquarie, there's more than your museum, how do you, if you're going to have a per capita funding in a particular area, how are you going to divide up that per capita funding between your museum and the other, and similarly in your area, Mr Benedet, between your facility, one's in Bathurst and scattered in between? I see the attraction of talking about the library funding model. I just don't quite know how it fits comfortably when you're talking about a much more diverse group of organisations that are not local government, but actually are independently controlled, different sizes, doing different things. Ms Sommers?
Thank you. Look, I guess we've maybe got our wires crossed a little bit.
Oh, mine are always crossed.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, we are the Port Macquarie Museum. There are other museums in Port Macquarie. They specialise in different aspects of history. So we are the museum in Port Macquarie. But on a serious note, the library, the state library funding model, and I guess maybe it's, you know, we have got our wires crossed because it's a model that comes from a state strategy around library services. And the state library take responsibility for overseeing standards and how that applies. So that's really where I'm coming from when we talk about a state overseen strategy. The per capita funding, I mean, I know our local government would say, you know, libraries have consistently been cost shifted to local government, and they would be concerned if they were listening in now because they're thinking, oh my God, we're going to, you know, they're going to make us fund the museum as well. So we're not talking necessarily about a per capita model. What we're talking about is an overall strategy that identifies what our museums are really intending or intended to do, and how they're going to be funded, and if you like, professional standards are going to be applied and consistently applied. And that's really that I'd like to see, because at the moment there is no strategy. I mean, we're talking about a new powerhouse museum, for example, but not in the context of an overall strategy, how it all relates, how we all relate to one another.
Ms Sommers, I think I agree with you in regards to the need for a strategy, although that might get me into trouble. But the part of the discussion this morning has been along the lines of moving from grants funding to recurrent funding, not only covering capital items, but ongoing staffing and other costs of operating. And in that context, they've talked about the library funding model, which is the per capita model. And again, so it's in that context that I ask the questions. I accept the need for a strategy, but if you're going to move to a library funding model, which is based on a per capita, the difficulty that I see, and I say this in front of the other members here, is that unlike libraries, which are which are local government owned and operated, your organisations are not, and it's going to involve in some way divvying up a pie in terms of that money, which libraries don't have.
So in my view, I don't think the library model works for us. Right. It works for museums per se. But if you look at the way that the publicly or taxpayer funded museums are funded now, I'm not too sure how they're funded now, but they're funded in some form. It's ongoing work. But is there a basis by which you could look at that and say, well, look, this is the way that these museums operate now under a taxpayer-funded model. Now, could we apply any of that? We're happy to provide advice to this committee, our thoughts, after this meeting on what we think could be a suitable model that applies to a regionally based museum.
Mr. Benedet, if you want to take that on notice,
Take that on notice,
would be
yeah.
extremely
Yep,
helpful.
I'll do that.
And can I tell you, I've looked at the submissions,
Yeah.
so I've listened to the evidence, and no one's yet been able to persuade me there's any kind of rational basis upon which the current funding is made, other
Well,
than
there
there's a
is none.
limited amount of money.
There is none.
It's historical and it's picking winners.
Yeah, well, that,
I don't think there's any surprise in that regard. It's just a question, who's the winner?
And if there's an election coming up.
so could I ask you both,
That's probably right.
maybe starting with the witnesses that are in the room and then going to Sommers on WebEx, putting to one side whether the library funding model is the right model or the not right model, is the big issue here the need for predictable long-term recurrent funding?
Absolutely right.
Is that the big issue?
Yep. But also in the context of recurrent funding that actually achieves an outcome, not recurrent funding that just churns over year by year. So to be able to go from an A to a Z outcome based on an ongoing program.
Yeah, recurrent
And that-
funding, which puts obligations on institutions
Absolutely right.
to actually deliver a positive outcome.
And to
for the
grow and become that world-class institution that actually then brings in tourists and other forms of support.
Ms. Sommers?
Look, I guess we've, let's call it something else. Let's call it maybe a vertically integrated funding model that comes from the top and disperses. It concerns me when we talk about recurrent funding because it can mean lots of different things to different people. I do think what we need across the state are a series of paid staff to help support volunteer museums. You know, I effectively do the job of a paid person at the moment. I'm not planning to do that for the rest of my retirement. And so I see the need, and it really comes around collection. So it's not whether someone can pay the electricity or not. It's really how important their collection is, and the story that it's telling, and the needs, the economic and social needs within those regions. That's what brings me back to this sort of, if you like, a strategy, overall strategy, and then some sort of vertical integration to fund that. So recurrent funding, yes, but paid people, that's what we really need to ensure. I mean, I spend a lot of time and money and effort getting grants to do training programs. I also mentor and train many volunteers across our region and indeed across the state and beyond. But you know, by the nature of volunteering, we come and go. We don't have to be there. And I think having some paid people with some consistency who could really, truly support all the work that our volunteers would just make an enormous difference to the standards as well of what you're going to see when you visit a country museum anywhere.
Could I just add to that? And I would support what said. I think one of the sort of, I suppose, conditions would be that you actually would grow into a size of a museum that actually allows paid staff to be be involved.
But Sommers, isn't that kind of the task that, well, I had assumed it was the task that was expected of Museums and Galleries New South Wales. You know, you've got this publicly funded entity, almost entirely state-funded entity, which is meant to be out there as an advocate for small and medium-sized museums and galleries. I had assumed that that was part of the task of that entity.
I've never seen any be able to advocate very well with their funding body when they're reliant on that particular funding body. So I make that comment up front. Look, I mean, Museums and Galleries New South Wales are a service organisation. They do provide some support and some programs. They provide a standards program and also a museum advisor program. And it was the museum advisor program that really, if you like, sort of attracted or, you know, enlisted me, if you like, into what I do now. But it's inconsistent. It relies on local government buy-in as well. Not every region in New South Wales or not every museum in New South Wales has access to a museum advisor. And the advisor is just an advisor. They're not there to do the work. The work I do with collections in terms of documenting them, digitising them and writing their, documenting their stories is really hard work. And not most volunteers, I was going to say not many people want to do it. In fact, most volunteers do not want to do that work. They're quite happy to open the museum, but they don't want to take it home with them at night. They don't want to be trying to solve how to pay the electricity bill next week or how to make their museum COVID safe. They just want to come and support the local community, share their passion and love and knowledge of history. But they don't want to do the hard stuff. And that's really why we need paid people to do that. And MNG are not funded sufficiently to do that either.
But do you think, I don't have a view about it one way or another, do you think, is that a structure that you could graft on some of these actual workers, the curators, the digitising team? Could you graft that onto the existing structure of Museums and Galleries New South Wales? Or would you be better off looking at getting a sort of fresh structure, maybe like Museums Victoria or whatever other structure you think might be appropriate?
Look, I'd really like to see the separation of museums and galleries in terms of service delivery, no matter what entity it is through. The work is quite different. And I did outline that quite specifically in our submission to your committee. So,
and for the record, I'm persuaded. I don't know about the balance of the committee. It's quite distinct, the work of galleries and museums. But
yes, so I'd like to see it separated. I'd really like a clean slate. I think it's time for a clean slate. Let's just say.
All right, and so what about the Museums Victoria model? I mean, I know there's more institutions in New South Wales. I know they're more geographically disparate. It may not be a perfect like for like, but is that a better starting point than Museums and Galleries of New South Wales?
In my opinion, yes. But but the real reason is not just the entity; it is the overall state strategy. That's really the difference.
Yeah, the fact they have a strategic, for example.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right.
For museums.
Yeah, it's an 8-year strategic plan for museums. I assume you'd welcome that in New South Wales.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, I wonder. Thank you. If I can put my questions directly to Mr. Benedet and Ms. White. I just am trying to get my head around this very strange firearms regulation issue. So I'm assuming that the reason why you got thrust into this challenging situation was because they were concerned, the government was concerned about security, I assume?
The ministers, you want to take that?
We were told something like public safety, but
Okay, so a similar sort of thing.
but we asked the question, but that was the answer given to us, and again, that was it.
I'm, just to be totally clear, utterly convinced by your argument that museums should be able to have operational firearms. So I'm not coming from a negative point of view at all. I'm just trying to understand. If you had museums, you talk about the potential for there being a range of factors that a museum should fulfil, and if that's the case, then they're able to own and exhibit firearms, yes?
Yep.
Yep. One of those, I assume, would need to be an appropriate level of security.
Yes. Yep.
Can you talk to me about that a little bit, about what you think is appropriate, what you do, and what, in order to alleviate any potential fears from government and the community?
The level of security is there now in the rules, and the security is back to base alarm. Rifles or things attached to walls by secure cable. If they're under glass, it's got to be 6.38mm thick. So yeah, the rules are there. We go a bit above the rules, but we're also always innovating, trying to find other ways to make it safe. At the moment, we're thinking of a way of blocking a breech of a rifle that doesn't destroy the integrity. So, yeah, we're talking about RFID. We're just sort of always looking for other ways of security because we don't want our weapons stolen either.
And how long has your museum been in existence?
1996.
And have you ever had a weapon stolen?
No.
Right.
And I don't know of any other
can I
museum in New South
just
Wales.
to elucidate on your line of questioning, do you want to explain to the committee what the difference between the current temporary disablement is and what the government's envisaging doing?
Okay, the government is
Because the question
envisaging...
was used about inoperable, and maybe we should just be
Yeah,
clear
okay, so
about what-
temporary inoperable is removing a part such as a firing pin, or it may be, if the object's under glass, it may be like holding the trigger back somehow so that it can't be fired. Usually it's removing a part. So if the weapon's stolen, the person can't take it away. They've got to either find or build a part to complete the weapon. Permanent deactivation is welding the barrel both ends, putting a steel rod down it, welding at both ends, welding every single moving part internally and externally.
What's the point of having it then?
Yeah, exactly. It
Thank you.
completely destroys, and it has to be seen to be also inoperable.
Apologies
So
for that
that means
interjection.
ugly welds along the edge. They can never be researched again. They can never be, enjoyed again.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you must have actually destroyed significant historical firearms to meet this requirement.
No, we won't do it. It'll be over my dead body that we do it.
Okay.
They refuse
Under
to do
that
it.
logic,
They refuse to do it.
under that logic, battle axes from the Middle Ages should have their
Well,
blades cut off. And
Terrorists
things like
can
that.
use a bus or a car
Well,
to run
quite.
into a crowd. Why not go to the Bathurst Museum and destroy their cars? Yeah, it just makes no sense whatsoever. And then the exemption comes along. How are they suddenly safer now? Because the Commissioner said, okay, your firearms are fine.
So
Just doesn't make
rather
Worried
than
about HMAS Otway.
Yeah.
rather than it being an exemption for each museum or each facility, what you're suggesting is that you should have to, in order to be able to exhibit and own firearms, you should have to hit a certain standard, and then it should be automatic, rather than it being
Well, I think-
at somebody's discretion.
We gave the Police Commissioner a list of things that we suggested were the standards that a museum should meet to have a museum permit. And I don't know what's happening.
And that standard is an attachment to our
Yes,
submission.
no, I've got that here, and I'm really engaged in this issue. The final question that I want to ask is, I think you said there were 64?
63.
63, thank you, museums that do exhibit firearms. In your opinion, and I'm not asking you to name them, if you feel qualified and it's appropriate to answer this question, how many of those do you think should be exhibiting firearms in terms of fulfilling the required, obviously you have a terrific focus on security and what's appropriate and what your role and responsibilities are. If you feel appropriate to answer that question, I'd be interested.
So under the current definition that's in the Act, of the 63,
In Franklin,
I think that probably
more likely to join Liberal.
no more than a dozen of those 63 would fulfil every criterion that's under the Act. If I give you an example now, so if I'm a publicly taxpayer-funded museum with firearms, one of the criteria as a permit is that you need to exhibit that firearm, right? That's part of what it is, and be open. Many of the publicly funded museums do not exhibit firearms. They're in a basement, and they gather dust.
That is the case with the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences in the Hargrave building.
Is that right?
They have an extensive collection, all in original condition, but not on exhibit.
So in a way, if a permit came up for a taxpayer-funded museum today, that museum should not be given a permit because they don't exhibit firearms under the definition of the current law.
Right.
As an example. So, and there are many other museums, much smaller than ours, that would struggle to meet every condition required. And that's the argument we've put to the Police Commissioner, and Police Minister, and also to Registry about redefining museums under the Act to be very clear around what's expected of those museums.
Absolutely.
And currently, the safety issue is important, and obviously we're at a level 8, level 9 level, and we've had no issue.
But,
Right, thank
Mr. Benedet, I assume we can all agree that security and safety
Absolutely.
is paramount when you're
Yep.
talking about firearms, and you would support set of standards that are audited by the New South Wales Police to ensure that security and safety is guaranteed?
No problem.
Yep. The issue that you have is that to the extent that they're historical artefacts, the idea that you would be permanently damaging them
Yeah.
is something that you find,
I wouldn't do it. I'm the
We
custodian
won't
in
do it.
charge of them, and I just would not do it. I'd go to jail instead of, I just
Well,
would.
let's try and not get there. The,
Don't go to jail yet, okay?
I just won't do it.
But are you willing to sit down and meet with the firearms registry and work through these issues so as we can ensure that public safety is maintained, and come up with a rigorous system that is more rigorous than just one-off ad hoc exemptions?
So we just sat down with the commander of registry before COVID happened and went through in detail for one day about the issues that you just raised just then. COVID hit and we haven't been in touch.
But I assume that's still on the table? You're happy
Absolutely.
to sit down?
It's a quick question of absolutely. And we've got no problem doing that.
And surely if we're talking about public safety, actually a set of identified criteria that can be met and then audited is a better public safety outcome than ad hoc exemptions.
Yep.
That's true. So under the current regime, annual audits by the police department is part of the deliverables, I suppose.
But do we know what they're auditing you against? I mean,
Don't know yet because we haven't as yet. We've been given a so-called exemption, but the exemption that carries for us for the next few years will happen hopefully next month. So hopefully I'll tell you back then. But
Is it true to say that the firearms registry's tick box, for example, is opaque and that you don't know what they're checking you against?
that's
It
true.
depends on what the commissioner wants. The commissioner's in charge of.
And has there been any change in your perception of the profile of public safety in relation to your collection that you would acknowledge? In other words, what has changed in the nature of risk?
Nothing.
The only
As
thing
I
that
said,
there's been nothing.
if the commissioner says they're exempt, they're suddenly safer than they were yesterday.
In the past,
So is
decade.
it? Well, sorry, I was just going to say, is it true then to say that perhaps this is being done on whim?
I don't know. I don't really know why it's been done. I think there may be an agenda. I don't know, but I cannot understand why they've attacked museums.
Have there been any thefts from
other museums.
other museums
I don't
that
know
you're
of
aware
any.
of in the last,
Yeah.
say, decade?
Look, I mean, obviously I'm not giving evidence, but I'm not aware of any thefts of historical firearms from any museums in Australia.
Kerry just said there's been 3 incidents over the last 20 years that he's known of, but I think I know one of them.
Can you take-
Can you take that on notice
Yeah.
then?
Take that on notice and give us some
Yeah.
details of
Okay, yeah.
I
what
assume
has,
that-
has not happened.
Yeah, I assume
Can
that-
I just one more
Just on
question?
what's getting...
Mr. Benedet, it's really directed at you, but Ms. White, you might be able to make a contribution. Do I take your evidence to be that you would concede that some museums perhaps shouldn't be displaying working firearms? Is there, in a sense, a legitimate concern that there is not security, adequate security at some?
Absolutely right.
Right. So that's that. So
We
that
feel
should
that
be-
maybe that-
And as was mentioned, we need a uniform level of safety that governs all museums, right? And there's no grey or black, that's it. There's a minimum standard. And that's what it is now, which level 8 and security that we have to meet. Whether all museums, all 63 meet those requirements, I can't tell you.
Is it true to say that under the old reg, you had one museum licence for all your firearms in terms of their temporary deactivation, whereas what was being proposed was an individual, every firearm having to have a separate licence in relation to permanent disablement? Yeah.
Could you just repeat that, please?
Under the old regulations, before they were changed in 2017,
Yeah.
you had an effective museum licence for
Permit.
all your firearms. In other words, each wasn't individually licensed. There may have been a list of them somewhere.
Each firearm, there's registration We also have a museum permit that covers the registered firearms. It also covers the prohibited firearms. Now, that could be any number of prohibited firearms. They're not listed at all.
That's
So
right.
that doesn't make a lot of
But
sense
what
either.
was,
Sorry, the non-prohibited firearms are individually registered.
Need to be
but your
registered. So we can have
Prohibited
rocket
firearms
launchers.
are done as
we
a
can-
job lot.
That's it. Yep. Rocket launchers, grenades, everything, all in. Well, not grenades,
seem-
but yeah, any.
That does seem perverse.
It is. Yeah,
Talking
it's
over
nuts.
each other now. It's yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So
Yeah.
your regular firearms, the ones that you could have, that you can have registered, they require individual registration.
They require individual
But
registration.
when it comes to rocket launchers and prohibited weapons,
They're lumped in as prohibited weapons on the permit, on the prohibited weapons permit. So that's a separate permit.
and
That's a
all of
separate
them are
permit.
covered under the one permit.
No, there's the prohibited prohibited weapons permit, and then there's the
Individual.
Okay. Yeah, there's also, have we got one of those? Yeah, there's also prohibited weapons, prohibited objects. So they're quite aside from the weapons. Objects are like, what's that? Sorry.
Yeah, so prohibited objects are like,
Are like flak jackets, handcuffs. Yeah.
so
Grenades.
all your prohibited objects are under one permit, and all of your prohibited weapons are under another permit,
And then
and
you
each
have
of your other firearms are on individual permits.
Are they're on the same permit, aren't they? We got
No.
two separate, no, yes, we do have two separate permits, yeah. Yeah. Oh, okay, yeah, objects, sorry, are not registered at all. There's no permit at all for those.
is it true to say there are many of the 63 museums that you're talking about are also, for example, private collections of firearms and related items, for example, in RSL clubs around the state?
RSL clubs are different to
Are they different
museums,
again?
but there are a lot of people that have a backyard shed with a lot of firearms, and they just want a museum permit for reasons of their own, so they apply for one, have been given one in the past. So they're not really museums, like not a true museum.
So are you not talking about antique collectors of firearms?
No, I'm talking about people with museum permits.
Museums, okay.
They have museum permits. There were some of those 63 are just people in a backyard shed.
But what this boils down to is public museums that have firearms collections, you believe there should be a rigorous set of transparent and clear guidelines that need to be complied with
Yes.
under the Firearms Act.
Yes.
And that may mean that some of the 63 museums can't comply with those, in which case they'll have to dispose of the firearms or not display the firearms.
Yeah.
But a subset will be able to comply with it, and we can all be satisfied the public safety will be properly accounted.
That would be the ideal. Like, obviously, in the past, they've handed out permits that shouldn't have been handed out, to my way of thinking. Yeah.
All right.
But yes, I agree. A full, rigorous set, and if you comply, you can keep your firearms. If not,
Yeah.
yeah.
Ms. Sommers, I know that you've been listening patiently. Is there anything that you'd like to add, or any recommendations or anything that you think that you'd like to canvass in the last few minutes before we switch to the next witness?
Well, just about the firearms, our museum is compliant with the regulations, but in talking to colleagues across the state, I do know that there are different the police force do assess the regulations somewhat differently in different areas. So there's certainly some inconsistency in the application of the regulations at the moment.
So, Ms. Sommers, I assume the idea that we're hearing from Mr. Benedet, that a set of clear, transparent and rigorous standards that are applied uniformly across the state on firearms for museums would benefit everybody, because you'd have clarity and predictability.
Does she have any firearms?
Yeah, well, we're happy with rigorous requirements for firearms and lots of other things as well.
Could I just mention, just add to that yes, you can have that as long as that rigour leads to an exclusion from the Act. There's no point going through that exercise and saying that you're given a 5-year exemption. It doesn't mean anything to anyone.
Just explain that. Exemption
So
from what act?
currently we have an exemption process in place under the law. If you're going to go down the track of looking at museums and be very clear around how they're defined and how they operate, those museums that fulfil that charter, in our view, should be excluded from the Act.
So are you saying that at the moment you've got a 5-year exemption and you're expecting them to come back at you again in 5 years from now?
Yeah, absolutely. So once, hopefully next month, we'll get our 5-year extension. They'll come back every year after that for an audit, and then we'll have to reapply again in 5 years' time for another exemption.
So what is the logic in all of this?
And we have the possibility that the Commissioner can at any time change his mind and say, well, you don't have that exemption anymore.
But rather than an exemption, if you had an express museums permit that you were granted, and then to maintain that permit, you had to maintain in accordance with the conditions and requirements under the permit.
For a
That's the way you
museum
want to
permit.
proceed
That's
forward,
right.
isn't it?
Yeah.
And we're excluded from those provisions as currently applied, as was the case pre-2017 for publicly funded museums.
Well, I'm glad you haven't been able to shed any light at all on why this rubbish has gone on, but anyway, I suspect that I know what it is, but anyway, we don't need to canvass that here right now. We actually do have a little more time because we had a cancellation. Could I just clarify with you, Mr. Benedet, there are 3 documents that you've handed up. I assume you're happy for them to be tabled and published?
That's right. Yep, no problem.
Okay, thank you. Are there any, Ms. Sommers, are there any other issues that you'd like to talk to us about that we haven't properly or even at all covered?
Well, digitisation is a favourite topic of mine, but I thought you might like to ask us about how we're doing during COVID and how the sector is going during COVID, perhaps.
How about we ask? And then, so what's happening with your operations, and are you in fact still opening your doors?
Macquarie Museum, look, we only closed for 11 weeks. We closed on the 18th of March due to some sector advice. And in fact, the day before, we had so many overseas visitors through from the UK and the US that we were getting a bit toey. We reopened on the 5th of June, and with a COVID safety plan, we've had to make a lot of changes at our museum. Worked years to make things hands-on. We had to take out as much of the hands-on as we could and become hands-off. I'm actually running late for cleaning duties now this afternoon. So, you know, there's been a whole lot of added duties put on us. But I can say that at our particular museum, only 3 of our 60 volunteers haven't returned. They were all very eager to come back. And whilst numbers are a bit lower than last year, I think certainly our Port Macquarie has been very busy with tourists, but I think they are somewhat reluctant to go into sort of enclosed spaces. So we've made a lot of changes. Many museums in our region have also opened, but there are also a number of museums within our region and in fact beyond who are really struggling with how they're going to cope with COVID. So it is a concern. And some of them probably really need a hand in navigating what needs to be done. I mean, it's all right for me to send them a link to the Health Department advice and M&G New South Wales and M&G Queensland's guidelines. But, you know, there's some museums out there who really need you to tell them, you know, how to do it in their situation. So I think that is, you know, it is quite a concern. And, you know, I guess that's where the sector's issued guidelines, etc., but it really hasn't done any hand-holding, which I know isn't allowed, but any hand-holding about, you know, how to reopen successfully, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Benedet or Ms. White, you got anything further you want to add?
No.
Could I just make a comment on inter-museum transactions? We have dealt with regional museums where we've obviously provided some firearms to those museums for display. That's gone pretty well. Obviously, there are codes of conduct, and there are also guidelines around how that works. The issues we've had, though, is between ourselves at a regional museum and some taxpayer-funded museums, where I think because they are the high and mighty, they take the view that they put certain restrictions on us, and which obviously, from our point of view, just doesn't work. So, when you're talking about inter-museum transactions of objects, that needs to be looked at, because there are a number of examples where we've come across where it just becomes too hard for us to even sort of contemplate. Dealing with regional museums, though, completely different. It's sort of on the same page. So if you're looking at a museum strategy and that type of thing, then one thing that needs to be sorted out is the issue of how museums work together when it comes to the transfer or use of objects.
Well, would the concept of having a sort of backbone of paid staff across regional New South Wales that museums could refer to, would that assist in transfers of objects between museums, as well as the sort of, the basic help that Ms. Sommers said is needed to just, curate, digitise, even organise volunteers?
I don't think so.
What the concept of a...
Yeah, I don't know. I suspect that the people that we've dealt with have got egos, and those egos just overwhelm up the whole discussion.
Mr. Benedet, could it be that in terms of some of those publicly funded museums that you refer to, and I couldn't think of any in particular at the moment, that actually there's a core of the staff within the museum who actually aren't in favour of regional tours of materials?
It could well be,
from their museums.
but others are. Others are.
Indeed.
But the discussions we've had at senior level with certain museums, it's like, well, who are you? I'm so-and-so, and you're an ant, and I'm the elephant. Why should I work with you? Even though, and I think that type of ego stuff gets built up here. Yeah. And if you're going to break that mentality down, then even though there are processes in place, those processes don't work when the individual doesn't want to actually behave that way. And we've had numerous examples of things that are really historically important that currently sit in a basement in Sydney. That if someone found out about it, they would actually be in front page of a newspaper.
Or things that belong with our museum that they won't hand over to our museum in some cases.
We have. I mean, we had some years back the ballast of the Endeavour, the Captain Cook Endeavour, right? The ballast that the pig iron was brought up to the Lithgow Small Arms factory to be refurbished. Okay. And of the 13 that were done, one was given to the factory as a thank you for the work they did. When the Maritime Museum found out that we had that one, they said that they wanted it back so they could conserve it but give it back to us 3 months later. That was years ago. And for us to get that back and to have that on display and exhibit because of the nature of what it was and what the factory did, and currently where that sits now, those 13 items are in the basement. Now, if that's good management practice, I don't know. I mean, I just think that is absolutely poor form.
So this piece of ballast was actually at our museum long before the Maritime Museum existed. So, yeah.
So just outline what ballast are you talking about?
Captain Cook ballast was brought up from the ocean.
I know what ballast is, but what act is
the factory when they first came, they were encrusted with coral, huge. So the factory took the coral off of all the ballast and 6 cannon as well.
Reef.
Yeah. So there were 6 cannon as well. I think they went to Melbourne or somewhere, but the factory did the ballast.
This is where they tossed everything
when they refloated
it.
To get it up.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
So they recalled this ballast from all small museums, all small regional museums, and when we asked for ours back, they started demanding that we have all these conditions like temperature conditions and conservation type things. When it left our museum, it looked perfectly fine. It's now sitting in the ballast, in the bottom of the Maritime Museum, not on display, and there's 40 of them.
Effectively as ballast.
Yeah, well, it's just a lump of metal, like a pig iron
Just
metal.
a lump of metal.
Yeah, well, they're all varying sizes. They're just whatever they had.
Yeah.
But they're all together.
Well,
Display.
I assume they're all in the basement of the Maritime Museum.
So effectively, are you saying that they were taken from you and not returned
No, they were determined not to return them.
So it's a sign of bad faith.
Well, yeah, well, snobbery maybe.
But I think your point is this, isn't it? That they are treating you in a high-handed fashion, and even though they're not putting the artefact on display and they're not providing value for it, they see absolutely no value in you doing that.
Well, we had that in a display with also.
I think you could apply that to a lot of museums.
Yeah.
I think you could
So
apply
the
it to a
factory
lot.
also made 23 muskets for the people in the reenactment, for the soldiers in the reenactment. So we had that ballast on display with that musket in a whole the Captain Cook display. So we still have the firearm that we had, but yeah, we don't have the ballast to put with it anymore. And people love to see it, and our volunteers love to point it out to people.
Well, I mean, putting to one side, some of the issues around Captain Cook, there's something extraordinary about seeing an artefact from that moment, from that time.
Yeah.
And that's what museums have, and that's what they bring to many people.
Yeah.
That you're there right next to something that was tossed off the Endeavour at a particular time.
Yeah, it's not about our museum, it's about the visitors' experience of, the visitors have a right to see that sort of stuff.
So I was just going to carry that point on a little bit further, and really, I think to Trevor's line of questioning, I mean, really, are we saying here, or potentially are we saying that there's a level of bureaucratic disdain for regional museums run by volunteers that perhaps forms around or obstructs the formation of good government funding policy? Is that the way to put it? Does that make sense?
I think
you're nodding your head.
Are,
yes.
very under-respected for the work they do.
So if we were to make a recommendation like that, it would go to the hands of the very people that perhaps would be prejudiced against preparing it. Yes, you're nodding again. Thank you.
Could I just ask one final question to Ms. Sommers?
Of course. You always get the final question.
I've been
You can
trying
have
to
the
do
final
this.
question today.
Have it if you want. No, it's about Create New South Wales in terms of as an entity for the the advocacy and the funding of museums. Do you think with your museum hat on, is Create New South Wales fit for purpose as the main public entity responsible for museums in New South Wales?
I think Create New South Wales is more about the arts part of the equation. I think the museum part of the equation there's a big hole in that, because there's a hole in the knowledge that they have. And so how can they promote something which they don't know very little about?
Yeah.
That's my view on that.
They seem to lump museums in with culture, but I think to them culture means theatre and art. Museums really belong in heritage.
Yeah. Ms. Sommers?
Look, I think, the name itself is indicative of the direction that department has taken, and it needn't have, if you like, left out the heritage part and our cultural material and our identity. But that is definitely what's happened.
What do you think of the concept of going over to the heritage, actually going over Create New South Wales and going over expressly into a heritage portfolio?
Look, it concerns me because our collections include visual arts and, our collections include art, and our collections include, film and etc. It bothers me that we might have to do that because, where do you draw the line? So just because we're a social history museum doesn't mean we're not also an art museum, or dare I say a firearms museum, and lots of other things. So it concerns me if it just, heads in that direction as an easy out. I don't think it's the solution.
I disagree. I think museums to be separated from arts. I just see like every organisation that's meant to do the lot as an umbrella doesn't. They head mostly towards the art. Or food and wine, as in the case of Destination New South Wales.
Well, you need to have a food and wine bar in the museum. Okay, on that happy point, thank you very much for coming today and giving us evidence. I don't think we've got... we have two questions, sorry, on notice. Yes, there was one, and then another one, yeah, two. The Secretary will be in contact with you in relation to those, and you'll have 21 days to respond. Thank you very much indeed for coming.
Thank you.
And sorry for the delays. Technology let us down earlier, but I think we've fulfilled the time